Okay, hello everybody. Today we're going to learn about the legislative veto. Sometimes it's called the congressional veto, depending on what textbook you use. But this is a really sophisticated uh, topic that's kind of a favorite of government teachers, of political science professors, constitutional law professors, and the people who make AP tests, because there's so many different concepts from our governmental system that are involved. So, first of all, it's called a legislative veto. Normally, when we think of a veto, we think of Congress over here writing a law, both chambers, the House and the Senate, passing it, and then it going to the president for the president's signature, or the president can send it back, and that's called vetoing. And that's explicitly in the Constitution. That's definitely spelled out in the Constitution. Well, a legislative veto kind of works the other way. A legislative veto is when Congress passes a law but includes a provision, a piece in there that says, okay, we have to hand this over. Once this becomes a law, we have to hand it over to the president and the rest of the executive branch. Here's how I draw the executive branch. The president at the top of all these agencies and the bureaucracy that carry out the law. The Congress says, we have to hand it over to you to carry out the law. But when we do that, we're not sure if we want to hand you that much power, so we're going to include a part of that law that says president and agencies in the bureaucracy. When you go to carry this law out, check with us first. Check with either the House or the Senate or a committee in the House or the Senate or even a particular person in the House or the Senate, like a committee chairman. And we might veto your action when you try to carry out the law. That's why it's called a legislative veto. The legislature is vetoing something the executive branch might do. So why would they do this? This actually became very common during the Great Depression in the 30s and during World War II in the 40s, when Congress, there was these two crises, the Great Depression and a war, and Congress felt like they needed to give a lot of decision-making power to the president. They delegated a lot of authority to the president, to the bureaucracy, to do things like they gave the president the power to rearrange the agencies in the bureaucracy quickly and at his discretion. They gave the president a lot of power to deal with foreign governments in the war. But they were nervous about this. Congress was nervous about handing so much of its authority over to the president all at one time. So they put in these legislative veto provisions and said, okay, for example, President, you can rearrange the bureaucracy, but check with us when you come up with your plan and we might veto it. All right? Well, the problem here is this practice isn't really spelled out specifically in the Constitution. The Constitution's not clear about this. So a couple of major constitutional issues can come up. First of all, the legislative veto might be a problem for what we call separation of powers. Separation of powers is, I feel like I'm misspelling separation there. All right. And so the separation of powers is problems can come up with this anytime one of the branches, like Congress, tries to mess with or use a power of another branch, like the president. So some people might say when the Congress tells the president or the agencies and the bureaucracies how to carry out the law, they're interfering with that power, and that's a problem for separation of powers. Also, when Congress tells the president or the bureaucracy, when you go to carry this law out, check with us. We might tell you, no, not in this particular circumstance. We want to clarify here that it's okay for you to rearrange the agencies and the bureaucracy, but not in this way. We want to be a little more specific now that the law has been passed and you're trying to carry it out. Well, you can actually view that as changing the law, revising the law, clarifying the law, and normally that requires passing new laws. And passing new laws doesn't just require a vote in the House or a vote in the Senate. It requires a simple majority of both the House and the Senate. And this constitutional requirement is called bicameralism. You'll remember from our lesson on how a bill becomes a law. Bicameralism, meaning a change in the law has to pass both the House and the Senate with a simple majority. And then a change in the law must be presented to the president for the president's signature or opportunity to veto, and this is a constitutional requirement called presentment. And bicameralism and presentment are both clearly in the Constitution. They're both required for new lawmaking, and a legislative veto might be considered new lawmaking legislation. All right? And in fact, exactly this issue has gone before the Supreme Court, and Someone asked the Supreme Court, does a legislative veto violate separation of powers, bicameralism, and presentment? And the Supreme Court decided that for all of these reasons here, the legislative veto is unconstitutional. This case, by the way, was called INS v. Chadha, and it's a really interesting case. I'll write the name out here. INS v. Chadha. It involved a man named Jagdish Chadha. There's Jagdish with his family. He was a foreign exchange student. He was born in Kenya to Indian parents, but Kenya at the time was a British colony, so he had this complex background. He comes to the United States to get his master's in political science, of all things, and his student visa expires. Well, so he's about to be deported by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, the agency and the bureaucracy responsible for carrying out immigration law. Well, the INS, under the immigration law they were executing, did have the authority to say, well, in your situation, there's an extreme hardship. Deporting you would create extreme hardship for you, so we can delay that. We can suspend that. But the immigration law that allowed the INS to delay a deportation like that was subject to a legislative veto. The INS had to check with the House and the Senate, and either chamber could say, no, we are vetoing, let me write this out here. Congress would try to veto the delay of Chadha's deportation, if that's enough negatives for you. All right. Well, the Supreme Court decided for all these reasons, separation of powers, bicameralism, and presentment, that it was unconstitutional for Congress to veto the delay of Chadha's deportation. And therefore, they were saying the legislative veto here is unconstitutional. And so I guess if you put together all four of these negatives, they cancel out, and Chadha got to stay in the country. His case took 10 years, actually, to go from the lower courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. He got married in the meantime. But this is the case where the Supreme Court declared the legislative veto unconstitutional. And you can see why government teachers love this, because here we have the Congress interacting with the executive branch, the Supreme Court using its power of judicial review. We have an individual challenging a piece of a law in court. And what's very interesting about the legislative veto is that this particular law with a legislative veto in it has been declared unconstitutional. But there are still other laws with legislative vetoes still in them. One of the justices in this INS v. Chadha case said this could invalidate portions of over 200 laws that had legislative vetoes. And the most fascinating and perhaps most important one of all is something called the War Powers Act, which is very controversial, very interesting, and seems to involve a legislative veto that might be unconstitutional. We'll cover it in a future lesson. All right, thank you.